Well, welcome to Dairy Livestream. I'm your host, Corey Geiger, managing editor of Dairyman. We are broadcasting from our cheese cave that's a lot cooler than the outside temperatures right now. Our studio in downtown Fort Atkinson at the historic W.D. Hoard and Sons Company building commissioned by Wisconsin's 16th governor, W.D. Hoard. Our conversation will focus today on let's talk federal order fixes. Frankly, this is an exact quote. Frankly, I think it's up to the dairy industry itself to work through this process, rather than USDA trying to dictate what we think the solution is going to be, and maybe a mistake so that Wisconsin thinks it's great, but Vermont thinks it's horrible. You all need to work on this and come up with a plan. Those were exact comments from USDA Secretary Tom Vilsack as he visited Wisconsin last December. So I'm pleased to have four milk marketing minds on this episode of Dairy Livestream to share their thoughts on this important ongoing conversation. This Dairy Livestream is just one of many conversations as groups like the National Milk Producers Federation, the International Dairy Foods Association, the American Farm Bureau, and many others formulate thoughts on potential adjustments to the federal milk marketing order system. As a reminder to everyone in our audience, this webcast will be available on our Hoard's Dairyman YouTube channel 24 hours after the live event. Dairy Livestream is also available anywhere you listen to podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Search for Dairy Livestream from the convenience of your smartphone to download it. Again, as you hear from our panelists, please submit your questions into the GoToWebinar control and question panel. The earlier you ask a question, the more likely it will get asked on the air. Let's get rolling with the conversation. Let's talk federal order fixes. Longtime viewers to this Dairy Livestream will know that Andy Novakovic and Mark Stephenson usually wrap up our opening dialogue. However, this time around, we're going to open with Andy and Mark. Michaela, let's go ahead with our first poll question before we hear from Andy. Based on legislation that created federal orders, what interests must be balanced? Producers, farmers, processors, consumers, both A and B, or all of the above? So go ahead and answer that question, and we will call upon Andy to share a little bit more detail on that real shortly. So we're at about the 40% poll mark here, and we'll just wait for a few more audience members to go ahead and answer that question. We're at the midway point here, and I think this answer is going to actually surprise everyone. And you got to dig back into the actual legislation here, but the correct answer, 22% of you got it right. It's both A and B. Excuse me, we made a mistake on this one here. We didn't update this, and I apologize to Michaela. We fixed it and did not update it. It should be producer, farmers, and consumers. So that's the correct answer. I apologize for that typo there, but Andy will expound on the correct answer. And so it's producer, farmers, and consumers that are specifically mentioned. And while processors are extremely important, that group is not specifically mentioned in the Federal Order Act. We welcome Cornell's Andy Novakovic back to Dairy Livestream. Andy, please frame today's discussion.
Thanks a lot, Corey. I'm going to start out with some kind of high altitude stuff, and I think we're going to increasingly zoom in. But I thought it was important to begin with a little reminder of how we got to this situation of government regulation and the particular form of regulation that we have. I'm going to make about 4 or 5 particular observations. The first one is when people talk about federal orders, before too long, they're probably telling you about the 1937 Agricultural Marketing Agreements Act. But actually, the origin of this form of pricing began not as a public initiative in the Great Depression, but as a private initiative in the late 1800s. Yes, 1800s. So fully 40 years before this became a government program, cooperatives marketing farmer milk were trying to experiment with ways to generate more revenue for their farmers. And one of the fundamental observations they had was that it was pretty obvious that there were some buyers who were more tolerant of higher prices, less resistant to higher prices than other buyers. And those buyers were people that served the fluid milk market. there was a sense that consumers, of course, consumers care about the price of stuff, but in the case of buying beverage milk products, less resistant to price increases. That led to this notion of classified pricing, charging a different price to the guy that buys milk for the fluid use versus the guy that's buying milk for a manufactured use, even though it's arguably the same milk. Of course, pooling came in because it was pretty quickly recognized that if the only guys that benefited from this higher price were the people who actually delivered milk to that plant, that the system would fall apart. And so we would share the revenues within some marketplace, defined in whatever way might have made sense at that time. And of course, generally much smaller. These early concepts of markets were around cities, and it wasn't like Eastern Massachusetts. It was like Boston and Springfield and so on were considered separate areas. Point is, it was an idea that came from farmers as represented by the cooperatives as a way to generate more revenue in total and share the benefits of that within the farmer community that supplied that market. That idea was generally regarded to be successful, maybe didn't live up to all its expectations, but by the time we got to the 1930s and all this legislation, there were over 60 cities in the United States that were using some form of classified pricing and pooling as a cooperative instituted measure, obviously with negotiation and agreement among their buyers, but nevertheless, this was a private initiative. The Great Depression kind of broke the back of that system, as it did with so many other things, and created an opportunity, some would argue a necessity, of having government get more involved in the economic life of Americans, which we need to understand was entirely unusual. This was what we did during the Roosevelt years early on is literally without precedent, outside of perhaps a few things that Abraham Lincoln had to do during the Civil War. And in that time frame, President Roosevelt invited industry to come forward and suggest ideas. And he literally said, I don't know what we need to do. You guys have got ideas, bring them to me. If you can convince us it might work, we'll give it a shot. If it works, perfect. If it doesn't work, we'll move on and do something else. And dairy cooperatives came forward and said, we've got a really good idea for helping to stabilize income and improve outcomes for farmers. It's called classified pricing and pooling. And if you would just implement that, wow, that'd be like way cool. Why don't we do that? It took about 5 years to persuade the United States Congress to get into what we now recognize as the Federal Milk Marketing Order System, or at least create the legislation that allowed that to exist. So it was hardly overnight, but eventually we did. And in this regard, this is kind of a second point. We need to also appreciate there's a difference between legislation and regulation. Congress writes legislation, and it defines the basic parameters of what you can do, and it defines objectives. Why are we doing this? And as Corey said, remember, we're in the Great Depression, lots of people hurting all over the place. Congress said, we're going to do this thing, we're going to allow this regulation to exist, and our express purpose, our declaration of purpose for this legislation is to help out farmers, but not to do so that it feels like it's horribly at the expense of consumers. And so USDA was charged with trying to figure out some kind of King Solomon balance between helping out farmers and not hurting consumers egregiously. And to this day, that continues to guide USDA in making these decisions. It's the primary reason why farmers don't get to cherry pick amended orders. They have to take the whole thing as it's presented, so they don't just pick the parts they like, because USDA's responsibility by law is to achieve some balance between the buyers of milk and the sellers of milk. There are some things in this legislation that structure federal milk marketing orders that are non-negotiable. they are fixed. Classified pricing, as we understand what classification means today, is fixed. It doesn't say how many classes, at least 2. It doesn't precisely define what's in each class, although it's understood that beverage milk products would definitely be class 1. Other things could be. There's nothing that says they couldn't. It doesn't say what the price difference is supposed to be between these classes. It just says classification. And it says pooling. It says the revenues from the marketplace need to be shared. It doesn't say how many marketing areas. It doesn't say a lot of things, but it does say classified pricing and pooling. It does afford some privileges to cooperatives, who were the ones that came up with this idea. Block voting is permitted. Members of cooperatives have to agree to that within their co-op, but the USDA says they will accept a block vote on behalf of members. Reblending is permitted. That was kind of considered just a practical thing. How could we stop co-ops from effectively deciding how much revenue was going to go to their farmers? If it wasn't in price, it'd be in dues or something else. And some provision for market service payments that recognize the contribution that cooperatives make beyond their own personal interests, but in the sense of providing services broadly to the marketplace. Those things are in the Act. A lot of other things are much more malleable or discretionary. Rules about who's in and who's out, rules about what's in this class or that class, rules as to how many classes there are. And if you look over the course of the history from the 1940s until now, there's actually been quite a few changes in how these things operate and what's allowed and what isn't allowed. People talk about this as if it was created in 1937 and never changed, and that's a little bit unfair. Lastly, I'll simply say USDA writes the rules that farmers get to vote on, but they're not responsible for coming up with the ideas. That's the responsibility of the industry, and that's where not only Secretary Vilsack, but every secretary before him has come in when he said, let us know what you think you want, and we'll see what we can do for you. But don't come here with 40,000 different voices, because we can't deal with that. You're going to have to narrow down the options a little bit for us. So with that, Corey, I'll turn it over to you and ultimately to Mark, and thank you.
Thank you, Andy. And good choice of words. When Andy talks about there's no cherry picking, he's alluding to the fact that at the end of the day, if there's adjustments to a federal order or the entire system, dairy farmers, producers are the ones that really hold the vote. There's no others that vote yes, yay, or nay on that order. So that's what he was referring to on the cherry picking comment. So reminder to our audience, you can go ahead and ask your questions in the GoToWebinar control panel. And with that in mind, we're going to go to our next poll question here before we hear from Mark Stephenson. What are the primary purposes of federal milk market orders? Establish minimum uniform prices, pool revenues, all the above, or none of the above? So go ahead and answer that poll question, and then we will hear from Mark as to the correct answer. I'll give the correct answer, but he'll expound on it. So we'll wait a few minutes here, or seconds, to give everybody a chance to vote that would like to. And let's go ahead. We're well over 50%, and we'll see what the audience said. So if Mark Stephenson was giving a final exam, 58% of you would have got that question right. All the above: establish minimum uniform prices and pool revenues. So with that, we welcome the University of Wisconsin's Mark Stephenson back to Dairy Livestream. Mark, the pricing component is so important as it helps us set a baseline for the dairy industry and what ranks among the most perishable food products in the consumer marketplace. Talk about the important role federal orders play in dairy markets.
Well, I'd be happy to, Corey. And, you bring up a good point that, we have probably more regulation in dairy markets than any other agricultural commodity that I can think of. And we have had for a long time. And in fact, most countries that have had a significant dairy industry have had some degree of regulation that just kind of spelled out these things. And it's because milk has properties that make it vulnerable to some of the whims of a marketplace. It's perishable, it's bulky, it's hard to move it very far to find another buyer. Just a number of aspects that have made some degree of regulation or at least guidance important. And with the federal milk marketing orders, as Andy so very well outlined, there are a couple of broad goals that USDA would try to take a look at when they're thinking about a federal order system. And those broad goals are things that would include order. I mean, that's in the name of these things. So they don't want disorderly marketing to happen. That's a little hard to define exactly, but it's one of those things that we seem to know when we see it. So disorderly marketing is something that they want to avoid. And then equity or fairness, in distribution, this idea of pooling. And we have these two tools that Andy mentioned, classified pricing and pooling, that are there to accomplish those goals that USDA would have. And, I would say that these are kind of blunt tools in a lot of way. And maybe the analogy I could make is it's a bit like flying a balloon. With a balloon, you don't have a lot of tools, but maybe your goals are to get up in the air some distance and have a great view and panoramic opportunity to see the landscape around you. And maybe your second and very important goal is to land safely. But the tools you have are pretty rough. They're pretty crude. You've got a propane tank and burner up there, and maybe you've got some sandbags on the sides. And at the end of the day, when you get down really close, you can open the vent at the top and collapse the balloon. But, that's the last thing you want to do. Federal orders are a little bit like that in some ways, that we know when we've got disorderly markets or when things aren't exactly working the way they're meant to be, but we've also got some relief valves in the system. One of those relief valves is that we don't have mandatory participation in federal milk marketing orders or mandatory pooling for manufactured classes of milk, only for fluid milk, if we have voted on it and we have a federal order in place. And, that's one of those kind of relief valves that we hope doesn't go off very often, that we don't have depooling occurring. But when it starts to occur and when you see it happening more frequently, I think it's an indication that you've got some problems with the current federal order and that we probably need to think about how can those be addressed. And we've certainly seen that type of thing happening in the last few years, some of those under very extreme circumstances, but that's a relief valve that a federal order system really needs to have. So it's time to address some of the changes that we hope will be made and considered, but the legislation that Andy talked about also ties the hands of USDA a good deal, in that they can't just do anything that they want to. These ideas have to come through a federal order hearing process. They will have to be voted on by dairy producers. That vote is for all or nothing. So, either you accept the changes that were recommended by the Secretary of Agriculture and you vote this in, or you don't have any federal order if you vote it out or decide that those changes are not exactly what you wanted. So, they're a difficult instrument. And I think increasingly, as our industry becomes more and more complex, it's become much harder to walk a careful line to find the changes that really fine tune this instrument of federal milk marketing orders. But federal orders do so much more than just classified pricing and pooling in the course of trying to achieve that. Price discovery is one of the things that they do in order to be able to enforce classified pricing. And, it has made a number of things possible, like the futures markets for milk. When we had delivery of milk as the option, much like you did for corn or soybeans or other commodities, it really didn't work well for milk and dairy at all. We had to have cash settled markets. And I think that the one reason those work very well for us is because we have this neutral third party, i.e. federal orders, that announce every month what that price is. And we can agree that we're going to close that contract based on the announced price. So that's one thing. They also do a great deal of measuring and testing looking at the components in your milk and calibrating bulk tanks, doing some other things, looking at in dairy plants what the use of product was and what they made from those products, and making sure that they're all accounted for. So all of those things I think would have to be recreated if we just decided we didn't like or didn't want federal orders anymore. The industry needs something like that in order to be able to function. So it's not going to be an easy line to walk as we think about the changes that we would like to see made, partly bound by the legislation that we either have or don't have, and partly bound by what's possible and what's compelling for an industry to find improvements in the current system. But with that, I would look forward to what Roger and Mike would have to say as well.
Thank you, Mark. And one of our audience members asked, what would a modern milk market look like without federal orders? Well, we're going to ask that question to our panel later on, but you heard some of the preview to that answer, the things that would have to be recreated without federal orders. So we're going to go to our next poll question, and that poll question is this: what % of the nation's milk was pooled into federal orders in 2021? 61, 71, 81, or 91%. So go ahead and answer that question, and we'll have Roger Cryan up next here right after we see that poll result, and where the answers are coming in rather fast and quickly here. So we're approaching the 60% response rate. We're going to go ahead and see what the audience thought here first. 53% of you got that one right. 61%. That 61% is a 6-year low and matched totals posted in 2004, 2012, and 2015. Prior to those 4 moments in time, the share of the federal order milk had never fallen below 61%, dating back to 1974. So we welcome American Farm Bureau's Chief Economist, Roger Cryan, to the program. Roger's been a dairy economist for over 25 years, about the same amount of time I've been at Hoard's Dairyman. Roger has a deep understanding of dairy markets, having served as the primary economist for a Southern Milk Marketing Regulatory Agency, think Federal Milk Marketing Order, with the USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service based out of Atlanta, Georgia. Later as a vice president for milk marketing and economics with the National Milk Producers Federation, where he was for 11 years. And most recently, he was director for the economics division for dairy program at USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service. And there he was based out of Washington, D.C. Roger, tell us how you are going about formulating thoughts as to potential modernization of federal orders. Welcome to the program, Roger.
Thanks, Corey. It's great to be here. I've been watching it since you started, and I appreciate being here. I have been at Farm Bureau now for 8 months. It's been an outstanding, fantastic experience. Farm Bureau is the nation's largest general ag organization. We have 6 million families in our membership, and we are, as much as anyone is broadly, generally, the voice of agriculture. Our members have had concerns about federal orders, like all farmers who are participating in the system. They have different concerns depending on their position in the market, their region, and so forth. We've had member concerns about price discovery and transparency and depooling, among other things. And Farm Bureau has a very grassroots policy development process. Most of our policies begin with a county Farm Bureau discussion and resolution that moves up to a state. Some come from some working groups or policy committees in the organization, but those generally are brought back to the states or even the counties and come back up through the process. So there's most of our policies go through several layers of review and consideration, which results, I think, in a relatively tempered and reasonable outcome in most cases. Our dairy working group has made some recommendations over the last several years that have worked their way through the system. The best of those and other recommendations on dairy issues have worked through county and state and national discussions. And AFBF now has a pretty substantial body of policy on federal orders and federal order pricing. The nice thing about it is that some of it is somewhat aspirational in terms of aiming at objectives rather than saying this specific formulation is the way it has to be. And there are a number of areas where we don't have policy, so it leaves room for conversation about the overall outcome, what it looks like in the end. And I think when Mark released his cost processing study that he did for USDA earlier this year, that was kind of the starting gun. Or was it last year? Maybe it was last year. That was kind of the starting gun for the industry to formulate new policy. That we've been waiting on those, and everyone is kind of looking, and I think everyone is sort of moving along the same timeline, same schedule. I think we're anticipating some hearings on prices and probably early next year. That'll be up to the USDA ultimately to decide on that, but it'll be initiated by the industry. And I think there's a lot of cooperation, a lot of conversation going on. We've been talking with National Milk, IDFA, and other groups, including some of the co-ops and some of the state and regional organizations. National Milk is working on some interesting things. They've been coming up with some good ideas and talking it through in their policy process. And here at Farm Bureau, we're really excited to move forward the farmer's vision of what we can do in federal orders, and to find ways to bring that into a discussion and help develop some consensus around the industry. As you said, Corey, when Secretary Vilsack talked about this, he said at other times, basically, if the industry can agree to it, he'll do it. And so to that end, we're aiming to have an industry-wide conference on federal order issues in the middle of October, in the middle of the country. We haven't nailed that hotel contract down yet, so we're not announcing a formal exactly the time and date. But that's our objective, and we expect to have a lot of these groups that I've been talking about involved in that. And again, our aim is to put the farmer's vision out there for everybody to see, and to build consensus around that as much as we can. And we've got a pretty good body of policies, and they're not they're neither radical or insubstantial. We have some of the things we're hoping to engage on is we've talked about indexing. There's been a lot of talk about indexing of make allowances. We are against that because indexing make allowances means they only rise as prices go up. It doesn't account for increases in the productivity, which would affect the yields at the same time. A lot of our policies lead to a conclusion of more regular reevaluations of make allowances through data collection, more regular reevaluation of class 1 differentials, for example. We also have policy. We don't support the idea of all or nothing, at least when it's not necessary. There's probably cases where federal order hearings could be optional, where the outcome could be optional. Not every federal order hearing it should be do or die. Some of them are, and we understand that. I understand that, but some of them don't have to be. Anyway, so there's a range of things, and we want to engage the whole industry. We want Farm Bureau to be one of the leading participants in the federal order discussions as we move forward on what will probably be a hearing in 2023 on federal order prices. And we want our members' voices to be seen and heard. So.
Thank you, Roger. We're going to go to one more poll question, and then we'll hear from Mike Brown. How many decades have passed since the last substantial federal milk marketing order, FMMO, updates? 1, 2, 3, or 4 decades? So go ahead and answer that question. And we'll make this one real quick here. We'll give people 10 seconds. The votes are coming in fast and furious. So let's go ahead and see what the audience thought on that one. 53% of you got that right. It's been about 2 decades, the early 2000s here. And we welcome Mike Brown to DairyLivestream. This is Mike's 5th appearance, and Mike just might be one of the most unique individuals in our industry. He's been, as an economist, he's worked for a breed association, dairy cooperative, dairy processor, and now a major market-leading retailer where he is director of dairy supply chain for the Kroger company. In addition, Mike also chairs the economic committee for the International Dairy Foods Association. Mike, you've worn many hats over the years and can balance many opinions. What's your take on the future of federal orders?
Well, I think that everyone, Roger and Mark in particular, brought up a lot of the points of discussion, and I would agree at this point, other than I think most people agree that there's a need for more regular cost surveys. There's not any detail on what that would possibly be. That there is a lot of points, and we've changed a lot. First of all, when you look at that 61%, keep in mind that's the first time California has been in a federal order, and we're at 61%. So if they didn't include the state order in those other years, that's a significant decline in pooling. And part of that challenge, of course, is we are seeing much more drastic differences between 3 and 4, depending on the markets, depending on what's going on. World markets have a lot more impact. Europe's heavy in cheese. New Zealand, Australia are heavy in, particularly New Zealand, heavy in powder. So those world markets can affect us because we export 70% of our milk solids now, not that milk solids. So it's and dry products, so it's a big influence on our markets. I think another challenge we have is that volatility has made depooling far more common, and depooling is disruptive. There's no question about it. When you look at some work that Cornell and University of Minnesota put out last year, looking at the impacts of what impacts depooling, it was pretty. I mean, impacts price or depooling. It's pretty amazing what an effect that can have. The other part, though, on the other side of that is when you have one-size-fit-all pricing, it causes challenges too. And I'll give a good example of the summer of 2020. When we had a 270 cheese market, but if you were making something that was used mostly in deli or food service, you couldn't sell it. You didn't have a market, but yet the value was based on a price that was very highly impacted by the food box program. Later on, they widened the food box eligibility to other cheeses, and it did help a bit. So sometimes things happen in federal orders that aren't the federal order's fault at all. And so we have those issues to deal with as well. I have been really, really pleased personally, and I guess as a participant in this business, there's just a lot of thoughtful observations and discussions going on and what the best fit is. And when we look at that, I have several observations, things we probably need to be considering. One is, does it make the orders truly provide orderly marketing? Depooling, in my mind, causes more harm than the federal order pooling helps, because it does make it hard to do risk management. It makes it very difficult comparing apples to apples. Because of the ability to depool, it causes a lot of problems. But how do you fix that when you have a pricing system that hasn't updated make allowances in 15 years? What's the compromise between both of those things that makes the system work better? Class 1, most of you know me, I spent most of my life in the cheese business. I came from Glanbia before I came to Kroger, and I have a couple observations related to that. One thing with Glanbia, it's no longer the case, but when I was there, the major production was in Idaho. Idaho voted out the federal order in 2004. One large co-op decided it wasn't working because of distant pooling issues, which I think are a problem for a lot of folks, and they wanted pooling tightened, and it didn't happen. Again, within the state of Idaho, about 3% of your milk goes into class 1. I mean, Utah is obviously somewhat higher, but it's a very low utilization order, which are harder to make work. So what we've seen in Idaho since then is, you would think that all we would have is cheese production, but we've actually grown powder capacity more than we've grown cheese. Idaho at one time was about 90% cheese, now it's about 70. So we have grown both some class 2, but mostly powder and a lot of specialty powders, milk proteins, products such as that, and even existing powder plants have added those capabilities. So they've worked, and I can tell you in that market, if you don't think milk doesn't move to its highest value, it does. When 4 is above 3 and you're looking for milk, you're scrambling. If 3 is above 4 and you're making powders, you're looking. It does create that. It probably creates an overall higher value for the milk that is sold. It doesn't necessarily obviously spread it as evenly as a federal order could do. So it's another dilemma. On class 1, we've been facing declining sales forever and a day. And it's been it's a big challenge. We have found, particularly with I would say the higher values, especially class 1 products, the indulgence, which are the ones my doctor won't let me drink. I call them melted milkshake drinks. The high protein drinks, those kind of drinks, the ability to forward contract outside of the order has been helpful because those products tend to have a more stable price. And as far as how they're merchandised, that has been helpful. But do we have the best solution? Maybe we already have it. Maybe we don't. But what do we do? Also, what do we do to make sure that it's still possible with class 1? I think since we were required to pool, I think having that ability is pretty important. My co-ops that supply me milk in the Southeast have a different view than my ones that supply me in Arizona versus Indiana versus Ohio versus California versus Oregon. So our markets have diversified in some ways. In some ways they are within the market. They haven't necessarily diversified, but the industry is very much diversified. We're seeing lower and lower class 1 utilizations. Part of that, again, when you look at the utilization, I think it was 30% last year, but with 60% of your milk not pooled, and since class 1 is required to be pooled, you got a couple, Montana is the best example, probably states that aren't in a federal order that still require regulation of class 1. What that means to me is that with those different supplies, the market needs are different. And again, we can't have 11 independent federal orders, but how do we best make them work within recognizing those differences between markets? So we all have our work cut out for us. I really appreciate the efforts that Farm Bureau and National Milk and here within with IDFA are doing to try to come to some good resolutions or some good suggestions. We're taking the Secretary's ask very seriously, realizing if we don't work together, we probably won't get anything done. And I think we all would agree that there's adjustments need to be made. So that's kind of where I'm at, and that's how I see lots of opportunities. The collaborative talking has been a huge help. I would view as probably the best it's ever been across groups. One example with IDFA, half of our Economic Policy Committee members are cooperatives. So they bring that cooperative understanding and cooperative needs to the table, which I would argue has made it a much more balanced discussion, and it's making it better. So that's my thoughts for now. We got our work cut out for us, Corey.
For sure. I'm going to use moderator's prerogative here, and I'm going to go straight to speed round and kind of a pardon interruption style. So we're going to keep the Q&A tight and concise. I'm going to call on one person who I think can best start the answer, and anyone that wants to add comments after I call on that person jumps right in. And if I don't hear comments, we're going to go to the next question. We're going to start with that first question I kind of bounced out there with the audience here. What would a modern milk market look like without federal orders? And I'm going to start with Mike Brown on this one. And Mike, I wrote this down. You said it, I think I got the quote right, mostly during our dress rehearsal. We do a little bit of a get ready for the main event. But you said something to the effect that people who say we don't need orders at all don't understand the value of information. Would you talk a little bit more about that question that was posed by this audience member?
That's a great question, and in my point of view is that if you're going to run a truly competitive market, you have to have reliable information. That's kind of econ theory 101. If you're going to have a competitive market, you have to have good information, and we all know market information is far from perfect. One of the beauties of the work the federal orders do on that part of their business is we understand production levels, we understand components, we understand through NDPSR the prices for the base commodities, and those are large volume surveys. That's all very, very useful. Whether you regulate a pound or not, that kind of information needs to continue to happen to have a market that works, in my opinion. How we regulate it is the big discussion. The fact we need that data, in my personal opinion, isn't really, shouldn't be debated. We need it. We need to have that good information to make fair marketing decisions for everyone.
Anyone else want to comment on that question?
Is the question still, what would we do without federal orders?
Yes.
What would it look like? It would be,
No.
I think it would look a lot like, the broiler industry. I think it would be tough for farmers to make their own decisions if you didn't have federal order pricing. Federal minimum pricing, the federal orders means that no matter how an integrator tries to define how a dairy farmer produces, they would still have to pay the federal order minimum, and that takes away the incentive to kind of get involved like that. The system also, the federal orders also provide quite a bit of support to cooperatives, which also is if you're going to have a handler that you own part of, has some benefits. So I think that's the main difference.
I would take some exception there, Roger. I think that we probably wouldn't go immediately, because of the characteristics are different, to something that looks just like a broiler industry. But I do think that one of the very first things that would happen is that you would find farmers and you would find processors running toward each other to secure contracts for that milk. And you would want to assure yourself of the marketplace. And, you know, that's going to be for some kind of price with maybe guidelines around that for some mobility of that price over the time period. But it's also going to be for quantity. You will deliver this quantity of milk and no more than that, unless we have a discussion where I've got the opportunity to make product and sell it. So I think that the world would look very different without federal orders.
Andy, let's go with the next question here, because we got well over a dozen here. We're going to start with you, and grab your seat. It's a long one, but very well written. Two of the founding principles of the federal order system were to establish minimum prices and pool revenues. With those principles in mind, what is the rationale for allowing manufacturing milk to be pooled when it can draw revenues from the order's pools and exit pools when it would need to share revenues with the orders pools, understanding the orders has its own pooling regulations? So that's a long question, but I know you're capable of taking a good swing at it. You're on mute, Andy. You're on mute. Start over.
There's probably a reason for that. Anyway, the questions are always asked as if there is only one answer, and like a lot of things, there's always trade-offs that have to be considered. In the structure of federal orders, one of the trade-offs was producer benefits versus consumer benefits, and you know, what exactly is the best balance on that? In this question, it's much the same thing, and the trade-off is performance versus equity. In the original concept of classified pricing and pooling, there was a notion that there was going to be milk that was always associated with that fluid market. Long year, short year, that milk, you were always going to draw on that milk. It just was a logical necessity. By the same token, there was also a notion that there was going to be some milk, probably some great distance away from the city center where most of the milk is consumed, that would never be needed. There's just no logical time when you could ever imagine that milk would be needed, but that there would be some in the middle that you'd have to call on in the short season of production, which usually ends up being the long season of consumption. And it was that sometimes milk that you had to figure out what the pooling rules would be for. And I call it the Neverland milk. It was excluded. Well, that concept had a certain logic to it, but it turns out that the guys right on the border between Neverland and sometimes land kind of, I'd like to have some of that too. And at some point, decisions had to be made about whether or not this is about performance. If we don't need your milk, to heck with you. Versus, oh, come on, everybody's invited to the church basement. We're all going to have some chicken. Let's just, this is for everybody. And that continues to be the struggle. If we look at places like California and Wisconsin and the old Western order, there was a much more of a everybody's welcome. In the Southeast, where it's a little bit harder to get milk for fluid plants, it's much more about performance. The Northeast would be kind of in between. And that's the trade-off. I can't say which is best, but I know that's kind of how it's been approached.
We'll go on to the next question. I think we're going to throw this to Roger, digging back to your days perhaps working down in the Southeast order area. Only 61% of 2021 production was pooled in federal orders. Is the industry sliding into deregulation without having a transition plan in place? Now, that's a loaded question, but I think it's worthy of discussion. So you get first chance at that. And if anyone else wants to chime in, they can go ahead. Roger?
I think that what's happened is that first of all, the class 1 differentials haven't been updated in a long time, and as milk prices get higher, the class 1 differentials are a smaller percentage of both the price and of the variation in the price. That's one issue that's causing some of these issues with depooling. We also have the smallest share of the milk is class 1, as has been noted, I think, by some folks in this group, certainly outside this meeting. And as that share of the milk that's class 1 shrinks, you've got less margin for there's less class 1 additional money in the pool in order to do other things with, to achieve other objectives with, like the splitting of 3 and 4 in order to let them both get, pay what they're getting for their products. There's a lot of the prices kind of have to be more finely tuned. I guess one of the things I'd be interested to know is what how Mike's business would be affected if advanced pricing was eliminated in class 1. I think deregulation will happen, sort of depooling and stepping away. That'll happen if we don't fix something, if we don't clean things up and modernize and do some of the things that make it more relevant to the changed circumstances. I mean, anything that's left to sort of decay will go away eventually.
Anyone else want to add?
I'd like to comment. Yeah, I'd like to comment on the class 1. If you let me use hedging tools to forward buy, I can live without advanced pricing, but you don't let me do that within the order. If you do that, we could make it work. I think the first thing, as far as differentials reflecting the value of milk, first of all, what is the value of milk when we're the declining consumption, declining production category? And second of all, as far as fluid is concerned, but a bigger picture than that is, how do we reward the producers that are fulfilling even those southern markets as fairly as we possibly can, Roger? How do we keep, you can call it pool loading, whatever terms you want to use, moving milk around, but how do we make sure that producers that are the most economically efficient, not only cost production, but transportation, which is becoming a bigger issue, to plants, how do we make sure that their true value of their milk is rewarded to them and not to somebody 6 states away? I think that's another thing that's a challenge for us. And I'm not saying we're going to build borders, but there's just, when you deal with regulation, there's just, everything you do has a consequence, good or bad, and it makes it very difficult to come to the best conclusion for everybody.
We're going to go to the next question here. I think we'll go to Andy. Do any other commodities, and we're looking outside of dairy here, have a make allowance provision, or is this specific to federal orders for dairy?
Well, I don't know of one, but I'd also want to interject that the reason we have make allowances is not because we feel sorry for processors, but because the benchmark that we're using to try to figure out what a fair price for farmers is at the wholesale level for products. When we had the old MW, when we were looking at other farm prices in other unregulated areas to give us an idea what would be a fair market value within federal order areas, we didn't have make allowances. We didn't care about that. Processors had to figure it out on their own. But we've said we can't do that anymore. There's just not enough unregulated milk available. The 61% number maybe might ask us to beg that question. But in 1999, when we figured this out, we said the only place we can look for a competitive price is now downstream. Okay, so if I know the price of cheese is $1.50 or $2 or $1.10, what does that tell me about what a fair value is for a dairy farmer? Fair to the processor as well as fair to the farmer. And that's how we got into make allowances. It has nothing to do with feeling like we need to compensate farmers or processors. It has to do with figuring out what should be the spread between our competitive value determined in the wholesale market and what is reasonable for producers.
Mark, the next one's for you. How might product differentiation be incorporated into the federal milk order system, specifically we're talking pretty much about conventional milk, so to accommodate organic or grass-fed milk, is that even possible?
Well, anytime we begin to split these products up into many finer divisions and things, it just becomes more and more complicated. And, one of the things that I've been a bit sympathetic toward, I think, is just thinking about, well, in our federal milk order system, fluid milk plants, class 1 plants, must be regulated. They don't have a choice in that if we have a fluid order in the area. But out of that regulation, they get some other things like advanced pricing, and they get performance, making sure that milk is going to be delivered to that plant over a period of time. When you've got products that are different, like organic milk or grass-fed or A2 or whatever it might be, it's harder and harder to have things like performance guaranteed, because you simply can't deliver conventional milk to that fluid plant that's bottling organic milk and say, well, here's the milk that you wanted. So I think that it becomes difficult to split some of these things up too many times.
Thank you.
I'm just going to second that, Mark. We do process organic as well as conventional milk, and you just can't, call the MA and say we need to have a delivery order. It is much more. It's independent of the system, and whether they participate or not, I'm not going to get into that debate here. But as far as is it providing that function for those specialty milks, it does not. And majority of milk isn't specialty. It's good quality conventional milk. So I'm not sure we can expect it to do that.
The next question's a little long, and I'm actually going to answer it first. And if anyone wants to jump in here, they can go ahead and do so. How can USDA, quote, maximize dairy producer participation, end quote, when federal order hearings are full of attorneys hired by milk handlers? It is difficult, if not impossible, for dairy producers to take a position contrary to their milk handler because most dairy producers have few, if any, options about where they can ship their milk and must leave the dairy farm every day. I'm going to start out with this. I think it's really important to be part of some kind of trade association. Pick the one you want to be part of and get involved. In 1872, the Wisconsin Dairymen's Association was founded, and he wasn't governor yet, but W.D. Hoard was one of the founding people. And they did that to get like-minded people together to advance causes. Then in the mid-1960s, the Wisconsin Dairymen's Association basically fizzled out. Wisconsin was America's dairyland, and boy, we don't need a trade association. And then in the 1990s, Professional Dairy Producers of Wisconsin and Dairy Business Association and their co-ops already existed, but these trade associations reformulated because there's power in getting together, and that could be involved in Farm Bureau or anything else, or your dairy co-op. But while producers can go testify at a federal order hearing and would encourage them to do so, you kind of got to get together and come up with ideas that fit into the entire system. So that's my initial response to that, but you all heard the question. Does anyone else want to take a crack at that one?
I think you answered it well, Corey. I think first of all, as far as attorneys, you'd be amazed how few attorneys are actually in a hearing. Now, you may have a lot of what we call ourselves economists, and one of my favorite jokes is what's the difference between an economist and an attorney, and it's the economist has less personality. So it can make for a dry hearing. But it is mostly marketing experts. Probably there's more attorneys from USDA at the hearings than anywhere else because they make sure we follow the rules. But as far as working together with organizations, because another organization that's looking at this right now is the Wisconsin Cheesemakers. What do they need to do? And there's other regional dairy groups, of course, that are looking at, as well as Farm Bureau and National Milk and IDFA. It's all good. I think it's pretty clear none of us have the answer, so we better keep discussions open. But trade associations are a great way to amplify your voice. There's no question about it, and it brings in just brings in good collective thought.
It's interesting, Wisconsin Cheesemakers Association, glad you brought that up. I mean, they have members from coast to coast that are like-minded in the cheese processing sector.
And you know, we have great lawyers. I mean, if they're your lawyers, you can love them. We've got lawyers working on Prop 12 issue in California to the Supreme Court, and the WOTUS issue, and you know, we've got. Sometimes you need those lawyers. Our system is built on that. But I agree with Mike that the federal order hearing process is actually remarkably open to participation by folks that are not attorneys. And I've seen farmers participate and testify in those hearings and have a very substantial impact on the outcome. It is probably more open to farmer participation than any legal proceedings I've ever heard or seen.
Right. I'd like to make two comments. One, the way the question was worded, it sounds like the person is equating cooperatives with handlers, and that's fine if that's their opinion. But if you don't think your cooperative is representing you, that's not USDA's problem. That's something you have to work within your organization. The second thing, and Roger alluded to this, if a dairy farmer shows up at a federal order hearing, I can pretty much guarantee you he's going to budge to the head of the line when it comes to being listened to.
Thank you.
Very true. And to Roger's point, if they have their facts together, they can be very effective. The big key is make sure your presentation, you can back up what you say. And that's true for all of us in a hearing, but they can have a big impact because they ultimately are the customer of the system, really.
So Mark or Andy, you can take this. So maybe we'll start with Mark. And we got a few minutes left in the webcast. Federal orders establish a minimum price each month. How can a company pay less than a federal order minimum price before any adjustments are made for quality, fat, protein, and so forth?
Well, Andy alluded to one of the ways in which that can be done. The cooperative is recognized as the organization of producers. So the cooperative, if they're selling milk to a proprietary handler, must receive the minimum price from them. But they are not obliged to pay that minimum price to all their members. They can reblend. The other thing, of course, that can and often is true is that if you depool some or all of your milk, then that depooled milk is no longer subject to regulated minimum prices. So those are the primary ways in which we underpay.
We're going to end with this question. We're going to give each of our panelists about 30 seconds to answer this question. And this one came in, and I think it's a really good one. What would a modern milk pricing system look like? What would a modern milk pricing system look like? And Andy's got the smile on his face. We're going to start with you, and then we'll go in the order that we came on the broadcast. Andy, 30 seconds.
Wow. I don't even know how to answer that question, Corey. Somebody's got some idea what modern means. I don't know. What does a modern shirt look like? What I would say is if we're talking about no regulation, you're going to look at a lot more vertical integration, a lot less transparency. It isn't necessarily going to be like poultry. It could be farmers going up. It could be, as they did in the UK, could be Mike Brown and Kroger coming around to farmers directly and skipping the guy in the middle. But it would be a bit wild, wild west out there. Still milk in the grocery stores, but it would get there a lot differently than it does now.
Mark, you could take this any direction you want.
Yeah, well, I tend to fall in Andy's direction on this, but I will say I think that there are intermediate steps, and the unfortunate thing is those may not be big enough to solve all the problems, but they may be incremental toward relieving some of those problems. And first one is if we're going to have product price formulas, we've got to update those make allowances much more often than we've done.
Roger?
I would agree. We need more updating. To be up modern, you can't be using 30-year-old data for your formulas. I mean, Andy's idea of a modern milk pricing system is the modern corporate system. Let it just laissez-faire, let the corporations manage it. If we're gonna follow our tradition of federal orders, I think modern federal orders system could involve two classes. We have a strong interest in seeing that examined more closely, and certainly updating things more regularly so that we don't fall so far behind, so we don't end up with distortions based on price formulas and price regulations.
Mike, the final word is yours.
Okay, a couple things. First, if you're going to have a system that really provides orderly marketing, it needs to include more milk. It can't, by regulation, force a processor into large negative profitability like we would have seen with especially cheesemakers in 2020. And you need to make a pricing system that makes pooling to that point less onerous at times. That's kind of my view. I think there is a chance for balance, but if we don't make changes, I see that 60% getting bigger and bigger and bigger, smaller and smaller and smaller as far as participation. Yeah, all the way around. And so we need to do that. Could we survive without any price regulation? Yes. Are we going to the poultry business? Kind of, we are anyway. Let's be perfectly honest, and I don't like it. But that's farms getting bigger, bigger, and bigger because they're the ones that grow. And are we seeing vertical integration within co-ops? Absolutely are. And so those things are going to happen regardless of what the regulation is. Some ways it's easier because of the reblend for co-ops to invest into plants. And it's generally a good idea for them to do that. I would encourage it. But I do think you have to understand, at least in my mind, I need to, when I look at these things, I got to say, what makes the system orderly? And
so Mike froze up there. We'll wrap up right there. Our next dairy live stream will air on Wednesday, July 20th at 11 a.m. Central Time, and will be archived on the Hoard's Dairyman YouTube and podcast channels the very next day. We look forward to seeing you then. On behalf of Mike Brown, Roger Cryan, Andrew Novakovic, and Mark Stephenson, I am Corey Geiger, your host. Thank you for joining us today. We wish you all a good day. Bye, everyone.